The Bible's New Testament begins with the book of Matthew. Like the three books after it, known as the Gospels, it tells of the birth, life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Written in the latter half of the first century, many scholars and historians believe it was written by Matthew, one of the disciples of Jesus. Matthew was a tax collector in the area of Capernaum for the occupying Roman authority. Bible teacher Michael Card takes us on a journey to Israel, the land of the Bible, to explore the life, times, and words of Matthew, words that prove the identity of Jesus Christ as Messiah, and what that means to those who choose to follow him.
The type of mount a conquering king rode upon entering a defeated city was a clear sign as to that city's fate. If he was riding a war horse, that meant he was coming in judgment. If he was riding a donkey, that meant he was coming in peace. It's not likely that the king is going to do too much fighting from the back of a colt. Jesus is not coming in judgment. He's coming to submit himself to suffering the penalty of the judgment of the world's sin. 33 years ago, upon his birth, it was said that the whole city was troubled by Jesus' coming. Now the whole city is shaken by his appearing. The newborn king that Herod the Great had so feared and tried to kill has returned, appropriately enough, to die.
Jesus enters Jerusalem as a king. Then the Gospels tell us he goes to the temple, and he enters the temple as a prophet. The words of the prophets are on his lips, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Now we're in the heart of the old city now, right next to the building that's traditionally the site of the upper room. So there are Christians singing upstairs, and there are Jewish believers downstairs visiting the tomb of David. So you might hear some pretty interesting music going on in the background. Jesus enters the temple and he drives the traders from the temple, those who sell doves, those who exchange money. It's the bookend of his ministry. In John 2, he does it the first time, and then in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he does it the second time. It's the bookends of his ministry. But only Matthew tells us that after he's done, the children are singing Hosanna, and the lame and the blind are coming to Jesus. And if you're not listening closely, you're going to miss it. It's the new reality versus the old orthodoxy. The old orthodoxy says only grown-ups should be in the temple. Only people who are well should be in the temple. But Jesus is bringing in a new reality. He's fulfilling the law and showing us a whole new way. And so now children sing in the temple, and people who are needy can come to Jesus there. We're here amidst ruins outside the walls of Jerusalem. Farther down is actually part of a palace, so this is a good place to talk about a wedding feast. Now remember, it's the end of the ministry of Jesus, the last week. We call it the Passion Week. And the heat is definitely on. They've already decided that they're going to arrest Jesus, so this would be a perfect time for him to soften his rhetoric. But if you know Jesus, He doesn't pull back. He's always pushing. He's always pushing. So he tells a story about a wedding. Someone's getting married, but not just anyone. The son of a king is getting married. And so you can imagine a royal wedding that involves the whole country, something like William and Kate getting married in England. The whole country celebrates this sort of wedding. The invitations go out. The elite are invited, of course, that's who you would expect, and the elaborate preparations, mountains of food, even wedding garments, because in this day, when you come to a wedding, they give you a new robe to put on. So it's an unbelievable feast. But then one by one, the elite start sending their excuses. They're not coming to the wedding, which is a serious insult to the king. And he is justifiably furious. So what does he do? There's a mountain of food waiting. There's a wonderful feast. He tells his slaves to go out, beat the bushes as it were, and collect the people of the land, the Am Haaretz, the Bible would call them. The lowly, the poor, they come in to this feast, a feast unlike someone like them. They've never seen a feast like this before. Now remember, Matthew is talking to a group of people who need an identity. Their identity is being stripped away from them. They want to know who they are. And so Jesus tells this amazing parable about the son of a king who's going to be married. And he lets the listeners know that they are going to be invited to this feast. They are part of a kingdom of which Jesus is the king.
The heat is on from the Jewish leaders as Jesus comes to the end of his journey to the cross at Jerusalem. The chief priests, Sadducees, and Pharisees cannot get their minds around a Messiah who speaks of love and a kingdom of which they are not the masters. They refuse to follow a man who doesn't obey their rules. Jesus is not the Messiah they want or need to get themselves out from under the power of Rome. And Jesus' message of a superior view of the Scriptures and of his oneness with God to them sounds like insanity.
We're now outside the southern wall, the old city of Jerusalem. Behind us are all kinds of excavations going back centuries. And once Jesus gets to Jerusalem, the Jewish authority, scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, they're trying to get Jesus to indict himself. They would love it if he would say something amiss that they could accuse him of. And so they lay all kinds of traps for him. At this point in Matthew, three groups come together with three trick questions. The first group are the Pharisees. Now their question is, should we pay taxes to Caesar? Now this question is formulated as a trap. They don't want to know an answer. If Jesus says yes, pay taxes to Caesar, he's in trouble with the Jews. If he says no, don't pay taxes to Caesar, he's in trouble with the Romans. But Jesus is not going to fall into their trap. He asked for a coin. And he asked very specifically whose image and whose inscription. The image is Tiberius, he's the emperor. But the inscription says, Kaisar Soter, Caesar is our Savior. Showing them this inscription, Jesus says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. They have no response to that. The next group that comes up are the Sadducees, who don't believe in the resurrection, by the way. And they pose a ridiculous situation to Jesus. A man who dies, and his brother's wife, he marries his brother's wife, and then that man dies, he marries the same woman, and that man dies. It's a cyclical problem. 7 brothers are actually married to this one woman. It's a ridiculous situation. But the question is, in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? The Sadducees, who don't even believe in the resurrection, are asking Jesus this trick question. And Jesus' response is very simple. Marriage is a non-issue in the kingdom. People aren't going to be married in the kingdom, so it's a non-issue. And then he jabs back at the Sadducees. Have you not read? He quotes the Bible to them. The final trick comes from a scribe, a single scribe. And this man is an expert in the law. And he asked Jesus probably one of the most debated questions. What's the greatest commandment? Now they've expanded the commandments to include 613. So it's a really hard question. Once again, I think Jesus more sincere. I think this scribe is maybe really wondering what the answer to that question is. And Jesus responds to the one question with 2 answers that are really one. He quotes the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God. That's the most important commandment. But then second, and also the most important commandment from Leviticus is love your neighbor. Love God, love your neighbor. It's a 2-part yet single answer to the question. So they've tried to trick him, they've tried to trap him, and they can't do it. And Matthew gives us not a single hint of a response from any of these groups. The reason being, there wasn't anything they could say. By now, you get the feeling that Jesus has had just about enough. He's tired of the traps, he's tired of the trick questions, and so he's going to set a trap of his own, and it is a beautiful trap. He begins with an easy question and follows with an impossible question. So he asks the legal experts, whose son is the Messiah? Well, that's an easy answer. Everyone knows that, David. So they get that answer correct. Then Jesus refers to a passage in Psalm 10. He says, so then, how does David call him Lord? Now, in their world, a father would never call his son Lord. So it's a more effective trap to them than it seems to us today. But they are speechless. And from that point on, we're told they don't ask him any more questions. That last question of Jesus hangs there in the air, unanswered and unanswerable.
In chapter 23, we will see Jesus at his most emotional in Matthew's Gospel, from disgust to rage to lament. His presentation of the woes pronounced against the Pharisees is by far the longest of all the Gospels. His portrayal of both what was commendable and far more what was worthy of contempt helps us understand the life situation of Matthew's first hearers, who often experienced persecution at the hands of Pharisaic leaders. Throughout the ministry, Jesus has consistently spoken of the upside-down nature of the kingdom, where the least are the greatest and the last are first. Now Jesus reiterates that the servant is the greatest. That, it appears, is the only title his followers should ever covet. The time is short. This, of all his teachings, the disciples must hear and understand. If they exalt themselves, like the Pharisees, they will be humbled. If they humble themselves, as they have seen Jesus consistently do for the last 3 years, they will someday be exalted.
Remember that Jesus' world, the world Matthew is written in, is a world that's dominated by rabbis, by Pharisees. And only in Matthew will Jesus actually tell his listeners, do what the Pharisees tell you to do. He'll also say, but don't do as they do, because they live inconsistent lives. At the end of this fifth block of his teaching, Jesus pronounces what we call the woes against the Pharisees. And this is as emotional as Jesus gets in the Gospel of Matthew. By the end of the passage in verse 33, he's name-calling. He's calling them brood of vipers, which is a name that his cousin John the Baptist, used. He's furious. He says that the Pharisees lock the doors to the kingdom. Jesus gave his disciples keys to unlock the doors. He's furious that they formulate ridiculous oaths. But most angry is Jesus about the fact that the Pharisees, whose forefathers killed the prophets, build their tombs, and in a way they're supporting the horrible things their forefathers did. This mention of the killing of the prophets really sets Jesus off. And he gets in their face and he dares them. He says, finish the work that your forefathers did. Jesus is daring the Pharisees to kill him. We've come now to the end of the public ministry of Jesus. He's pronounced the woes against the Pharisees. He's exhausted his anger. So after the woes comes the lament. After the anger come the tears. And in his prophetic imagination, Jesus sees this city destroyed by Titus, the Roman general. He sees what Josephus describes, piles of human corpses, cannibalism, unimaginable suffering, and he begins to weep. Earlier, as the prophet, Jesus has spoken the words of God. That's what prophets do. But now he becomes much more. He weeps the tears of the Father. See these uneven steps, a long step, short step, long step. Some of these back here are the original steps that went up into the temple. And they're staggered on purpose this way so that you can't simply run up into the steps or run up into the temple on these steps. You have to thoughtfully and slowly make your way. As Jesus and the disciples were leaving the temple, perhaps right down these actual steps, there's just been an emotional time. He's pronounced the woes against the Pharisees. He's been calling them broods of vipers. He's lamented the destruction of the temple. Very emotional time. And the disciples do what friends often do. They try to distract Jesus. They try to make small talk. And they point out to Jesus the massive stones as if he's never seen them before. But Jesus' mood is still dark. He makes an amazing statement. He says, you see these stones? Not one stone is going to be left on top of another. To the disciples, it sounded like the end of the world. And so they asked two questions, and this is very important. Two separate questions to which Jesus will give two separate answers. The first question is, when will these things happen? That is, when will these stones be torn down? And the second question is, what will be the signs of your coming? Two questions. Now Jesus gives two separate answers. His first answer is going to describe the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, when Titus will literally tear every one of the stones down and throw them over the wall. Jesus is describing something you can run away from. Pray that your flight won't be in winter, he says. Very concrete answers to the first question, when will these things happen? And then he shifts his tone. He starts talking apocalyptic. The moon turns to blood, the sun won't shine. And he describes something that you can't run away from, something that's going to involve the whole world. And the disciples are hearing this and taking this all in. They were just making small talk. I guess they didn't know what they were getting themselves into. The way the discussion ends is, when are these things going to happen? How are we going to know? And Jesus closes this disturbing session by saying, no one knows. Not even the Son. Only the Father knows when these things are going to take place. And so the way to be ready is not to be looking for signs the way so many people do. The way to be ready is to be found serving when He comes back.
If you take the time to read Josephus' account of the siege of Jerusalem in books 5 and 6 of his The Jewish Wars, you will appreciate Jesus' words in verses 21 and 22. To the Jewish mind, the destruction of Jerusalem was the most devastating event in the history of the world. Jesus repeats his warning about false and deceiving messiahs who may even be able to perform miracles. No matter what they hear, they are not to listen to the lies. Jesus will not appear in the desert nor in the inner rooms. When he does return, there will be no question. It will be a cataclysmic event that everyone will behold like lightning moving across the sky.
This is an actual first century pavement. It used to be about 70 feet underground. When the archaeologists dug down, they found these enormous stones, the actual stones from Herod's temple. Jesus said, not one stone will be left on top of the other, and here they are. It's an incredible thing to see. And we're coming to the final teaching of Jesus. From this point on, Gethsemane happens and the arrest and the crucifixion, and things move very quickly. So virtually the last lesson Jesus teaches his disciples has to do with separating the sheep and the goats. And this was an ancient idea. The sheep can sleep outside at night because they have their wool coats, but the goats have to be put inside because they can't stand it being cold. What happens next is a huge picture, a dazzling picture. The Son of Man comes, Jesus comes, and attending him are thousands of angels. It's the end time, and the separation is about to begin. But it's not what anyone might have expected, because what Jesus does on the throne, he begins reciting a lyrical poem. It might have even been a song. I was hungry, you fed me. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink, and on it goes. I was a stranger, you visited me. It ends up, I was in prison and you came to me. This is what he sings, I think in a major key, to the sheep. But what I find most fascinating is the sheep are confused. They respond, when did we ever see you a stranger or hungry or thirsty, all these things? And Jesus responds, whenever you did it to the least of these, you were doing it to me. But then the tone shifts and Jesus sings the song again, virtually the same lyric, the identical structure. He turns to the goats and he begins to recite, or perhaps to sing, I was hungry, you didn't feed me. I was thirsty, you gave me nothing to drink. And on the song goes. And this group of people are confused as well. I think it's fascinating that both groups are confused. They say, when did we ever see you hungry, thirsty, a stranger in prison, all these things? And Jesus responds, when you didn't do these things to my brothers, you neglected to do them to me. It becomes the basis for the separation of the sheep and the goats. I find it fascinating that both groups had no idea what was going on. The group that is ushered into heaven had no idea that it was Jesus they were feeding in the distressing disguise of the poor. But most horrifying, those who are cast out neglected the poor, they neglected the prisoner, they neglected the stranger, and they didn't realize all the while that it was Jesus they were neglecting. It's evening here in the old city of Jerusalem. You can see people making their way home. It's getting dark. In all the Gospels, Judas is a dark mystery. But Matthew shines more light on his character than any of the other Gospels. People love to speculate about Judas' motives, but Matthew makes it clear. Judas goes to the high priest and asks, what will you give me if I hand him over to you? Now we're told that he's paid 30 pieces of silver. In Exodus 21, that's the base price of a slave. About $5,000, you can figure it that way. So an interesting financial exchange takes place during Passion Week. Early in the week, we're told that Mary anoints Jesus' head with $20,000 to $30,000 worth of perfume. She pours that perfume out on the ground. Judas, on the other hand, he makes a profit of $5,000.